Oh, yeah, but you have to say, I'm not going to let's say it's 60, you get I'd say what if you just have one is the 65 is the night. So I'm waiting for them. And I may have to report to the supplemental TIA. This is for the primary funds. But we need somebody in there that's Can I ask you if the president says I was, they may not this is not a tea party. This is a drunken party. No, I think you know, going is the government, and the government should be going together with that. I love this. There is a plan in the back.
Delaunay programs. No, she just wants to see the ugly sister. But does it at least?
Yes.
Yeah, you can't do long. Then I would. The other ones.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for coming, and welcome everyone who's watching online, apparently. I'm so glad that the weather's improved, so hopefully when you leave, you'll be able to envision yourself strolling through Paris on an April evening, circa 1925. I'm Susan Brown, Assistant Curator for Textiles here at the museum, and together with Matilda McQuaid, Deputy Curatorial Director, curated the exhibition upstairs, Color Moves, Art and Fashion by Sonia Delaunay. In fact, before I go any further, I would like to thank the many organizations and individuals who supported the exhibition, so many that I had to write them down. The Horace W. Goldsmith Foundation, the Kobe Foundation, the Anna Maria and Stephen Kellen Foundation, the Aaron Krantz Fund, the Esme Uzden Exhibition Endowment Fund, the Joseph and Annie Albers Foundation, Lisa S. Roberts, furthermore, a program of the J.M. Kaplan Fund, the Consulate General of the Netherlands, and the Felicia Fund. So when you're researching an exhibition, naturally you read as widely as possible, but there are always a handful of books that become trusted friends and constant companions. For us, one of those books was Arthur Cohen's superb monograph, Sonia Delaunay, published in 1975. And the other was Sherry Buckberrough's Sonia Delaunay, a Retrospective. This was the catalog for the last major museum exhibition on Sonia Delaunay's work in the United States. It was originated at the Albright Knox Art Museum in Buffalo and then traveled to New York, Atlanta, Houston, Chicago, and Montreal. But that exhibition was organized just a year after Sonia Delaunay's death in 1979. So we're very, very excited to be bringing Sonia Delaunay back to New York for a new generation of artists and designers. Dr. Buckberrough must have been a very young scholar when she wrote this catalog. Her doctoral dissertation on Robert Delaunay was published 3 years later, and in the intervening years she's become a very widely published author on women artists of the modern era as well as contemporary. And she's recently branched out into eco-art and is the founder of an organization called the, she just told me a minute ago, Parks Water Artists, an umbrella organization that brings together arts organizations around ecology issues in general, and in particular around the preservation of the Park River in Hartford. She is also the chair of the art history department at the University of Hartford. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Sherry Buckberrough.
Thank you very much, Susan. And I'm so pleased to be here tonight and to see such a crowd that has come out for Sonia Delaunay, because she hasn't been seen in the United States for such a long time. And I was so thrilled when I heard about this exhibition, and was even more thrilled when I saw how well it's been received. It is really a beautiful exhibition. You did a great job, and the material, of course, is wonderful. So tonight I'm going to be talking, as you know, about Sonia Delaunay and the New Woman. And the image that you see up here is the one that was used on a lot of the publicity for the exhibition. So I decided to use that as my first slide because I think probably several of you are already familiar with it. There are two models, as you can see, wearing Sonia Delaunay beachwear in 1928, and I will propose to you that they are very definitely, pardon me, quote unquote, new women. They look happy, don't they? Okay, right. That was sort of one of the things about the new woman of the 1920s, was that she was happy and she wasn't afraid to show it, and she could show it by actually looking directly out at the camera, which means out at you, the audience, direct contact with people, not having to sort of look down at the floor, not having to be demure, but being very, very present. We would say today liberated. And in fact, the liberation, I think you can also see, is part of the clothing design, which is it's a bathing suit, but this was very, very short bathing suit for the time. The ones worn earlier came down to the knees, or earlier than that, they came down much further. So she's, the new woman is liberated in terms of freedom of the body, and she's liberated in terms of freedom of emotion and freedom of expression. And this was something that was really a phenomenon, a type of woman that began to emerge, we could say, before the First World War, but certainly became a phenomenon that everybody was talking about by the 1920s. And here we have another couple of new women, and you might well recognize one of them here, which is Coco Chanel. Coco Chanel was certainly I suppose we could say, the archetype for the new woman of the 1920s. She was independent, and that was one of the foremost characteristics of the new woman, is that she acts independently. Coco Chanel was known for acting independently, founding her own fashion house, leading her own life as a single woman, leading her own life in terms of sexual liberty as well, and sort of just leading the way for women to lead the kind of life that men had led up to that time. And what we have over here on the left is a fashion that is in the style of Chanel, but it's a sort of typical kind of fashion from the mid-20s, probably about 26 or so, I would say, for this, in which you can see that the model has a short skirt, that she's wearing a loosely fitting top. We'll see more of these later. But more than anything, this is the other point about the new woman, is that she is in motion. She's heading out the door on her own. The car is waiting for her, and she's about to go someplace interesting, we assume. So motion and independence are the characteristics of the new women. Okay. The new woman, well, okay, let's see how things changed and how quickly they changed. Here we have a photograph from about 1900. Actually, I think it's probably a little later. I think it's about 1904 or so, taken inside the Café de la Paix in Paris, and we can see how, about 20 years earlier, women were still in fashion that went from their neckline down to their wrists and all the way down to the floor, and that they were, oh, sorry, wrong one. Whoa, I gave it away, okay. And that they're certainly wearing corsets, these very, very tight wasp waistlines, and the corsets most definitely kept them in good posture. They have their shoulders back, and they are erect because they couldn't bend. And that, of course, meant that their gestures and their mode of walking was extremely restricted and, of course, very formulaic in terms of the way that women were supposed to act at that time. So it's only 20 years later, and you already, oops, I'm going to have trouble with this. Okay, it's backwards from the one I usually use. 20 years later, we see what's happened. This is the new woman after the war, and she most certainly has been liberated. Actually, these are women in Chicago. So the new woman emerged in Europe, and certainly Paris took a lead in the development of this new concept of women, but it came to the United States very, very quickly, and women ran with it, doing the Charleston. So the idea of liberation of movement, liberation of the limbs we see expressed in these new dance forms, and having a good time playing on the beach, and a full facial expression of a kind of happiness. These actually happen to be bathing suits from about 1926, designed by Lanvin. So we have designer bathing suits, which were usually made out of wool, by the way, still at this point. Okay, so we've got an incredible amount that took place in terms of the transformation of the image of women during those 20 years. Now let's look a little bit more closely at what the fashion of the new woman really was. And I have a line up here of some designs by Worth and Nicole Crew and Pachu that give you good examples from the mid-20s. So one of the things that, I'm really going to screw this up. I should have my own here. one of the things we notice is the shortened hemline. Hemlines were beginning, well, they began to come up just a little bit before the war, but during World War I, when all of the men went off to war and women went to work in factories and other places, though women working really, it didn't work to try to actually do the 8 to 5 number in those corsets, and in the long skirts, and in the long sleeves. So for the sake of actually making a living and keeping the world running during the war, more practical kinds of clothing were developed. And after the war, most women really wanted to keep those clothing, that kind of clothing. They weren't interested in going back to the old style, and particularly in America, there was a kind of rebellion. Parisian designers wanted to lengthen the skirts again. American women wouldn't buy them, so they had to change, as a matter of fact. So we have the length, we have the shortened hemline, we have oftentimes no sleeves at all, so freedom of the limbs here. We have no waistline either, so the corset is no longer demanded at all, it's been done away with. On the other hand, you will also certainly see that the models, which of course in these fashion plates have been elegantly lengthened, so they're really, really tall, but they all are also very, very slim. And that was not just a fashion plate design, but that was what the style was about. The women were supposed to be thin with very few curves, no bust, no hips, and not all women are built that way. So in actual fact, even though this was a style of liberation, it was at the same time a problem for women who had full figures. And many of those women had to tape down their breasts and, of course, wear girdles in order to try to get themselves to look flat. So one way or the other, women were, the issue of liberation of the body has to be taken, looked at from several sides. But to continue on, the new woman wears short hair. She has bobbed her hair. This was called the bob, and this was a style this was the first time that we have this kind of short hair as a phenomenon on women in the West, and it emerged in the very early 20s, even a little earlier with a couple of rare instances. But by the mid-20s, women were massively bobbing their hair. The hairstylists thought that this was just such a quick fad that they weren't going to deal with it. So the women went to barbershops, which of course the women invading barbershops got the men rather upset as well. So there was one of the things that happens as a result of this is this mixture of women and men in places where they had not been mixed together previously. The type of hat that is common during the period is the cloche hat, and you see some of those upstairs. And this very, very tight-fitting hat that really hides the hair goes very well over the bob, certainly. It also worked very well for riding in automobiles, which was, of course, a new phenomenon, and riding against the wind in a convertible, which would be a wind that hadn't been experienced to this state up to this time. So it actually is associated with this concept of motion that is very much a part of the new woman's image. The bob and the cloche hat were pulled down so closely to the head that they gave the silhouette of the new woman an androgynous look. It didn't seem that she was any longer a woman, and that was, of course, the outrage of all sorts of people about both the bob and the cloche hat, was that there was nothing left of the woman. She'd become something else, and the something else wasn't clear. It looked like something sort of between a man and a woman, perhaps like a young boy, but whatever it was certainly disturbing to plenty of people. Okay, so before I leave these, I should say that one of the things that we should keep in the background of the things that I'm going to talk about tonight is the expansion, the extraordinary expansion of the fashion industry in Paris after the war. This was the time when most of the big fashion houses that you've heard of, many of which still exist today, became known around the world. And this was also the period in which Paris began to market itself as a city on the basis of its ability to produce fashion, accessories, home decor, all of those things that women love to buy. So capital for particularly women's taste. Okay. Here we have Sonia Delaunay. And she's working in her studio which was in her apartment on the Boulevard Malherbe in probably around 1926 or so. And we can see that she's wearing one of her own fashions, a skirt here that was embroidered wool with her designs on it, but that she's also wearing it's a short skirt, and she's wearing a loosely fitting blouse. We can't see exactly what it is, but she's wearing the garb of the new woman, most definitely. And sitting before a design for textiles. This is actually the design for what is purported to be the very first textile design that she made, number 6. She always gave them individual numbers. But we can see that she's got lots of other designs that are all around the background. So she's not doing the very first one here. She's just brought it back here for this publicity photograph. And publicity photographs were, in fact, very important for her, but also for what I'm going to be saying tonight. I want to give you a little bit of background on Sonia Delaunay. For many of you probably already know some of this, but just in case. She was born in the Ukraine and was born into a working class Jewish family where she lived till the age of 5, at which point the one uncle who had received a very good education and became a lawyer in St. Petersburg and married very well there, wished to adopt her. And although she was never formally adopted, she went from working class life in a small town in Ukraine to St. Petersburg, where she lived, one could say, a really palatial existence. The family traveled a lot, and she traveled with them. She had 3 different governesses who taught her English, French, and German. She had just about anything that she wanted to have, and she seemed to thoroughly enjoy all of that. If we read her diaries, her discussion of the life, although she found it very confining, she certainly enjoyed the advantages that it gave her. And it's, I think, one aspect of her ability to be a new woman, not only her personality, which was one that was strongly independent, but she also had independent money, independent wealth. And that was significant, particularly when she struck out on her own. She came to art school in Germany and stayed there for a couple of years, and then wanted very much to go to Paris, where art was liberated, and she came to Paris around 1905, 1906, and really wanted to stay there, and tried all sorts of different ways to try to convince her aunt and uncle, who were her adopted parents, to let her stay, and they thought that it would be much better for her to come back to St. Petersburg and marry properly. But she was definitely she was determined that she was going to stay in Paris, and so she found a way to do it. And this is also very important. It's part of the new woman. The new woman finds a way to do things. She struck up a friendship with a avant-garde gallery owner by the name of Wilhelm Oede, who was German and also homosexual. And they arranged a marriage of convenience, that lasted for about a year, but that allowed her to receive the money that had been promised her when she married, and also to stay in Paris. And in fact, it also made it very possible for her to exhibit in her husband's gallery, which began to move her art in the right direction professionally. But less than a year later, she met Robert Delaunay, who was a young progressive artist and very French, and they fell madly in love. And so there was an amicable divorce, and she married Delaunay, 7 months pregnant, and and that marriage stayed together forever. So she went from being Ukrainian Jewish to becoming more Russian, and very assimilated, to moving through Germany into France, where she then got French citizenship. So I think that we could say that she was thoroughly cosmopolitan and mobile. She moved. She was on the move a lot. This photograph is taken when her business was really probably growing and perhaps right at its height, where she was expanding like mad. The business in Paris was a business in which she produced fashion designs, accessory designs, but had expanded out into textile designs, and that's what you see here, and on the floor as well, or at least at the side of the table. And it certainly was the textile designs, which we have so many examples of upstairs, that made the most money for her and perhaps have had the most influence. Okay, I'd like to say a little bit more about her personality, because I think that there are, among probably many others, two different kinds of women that she aspired to. One, most certainly, was the new woman, the independent woman, and the businesswoman side of her was very much attached to that image. But another kind of woman for which she certainly had a strong sensibility was a much older model, and I'm going to call her the exotic or the oriental woman. And if you think about scenes from 19th century academic art of harems, or if you think about Ingres, Delacroix, or Matisse even, that's the kind of woman that we're talking about, these exotic scenes of faraway lands, particularly sort of in places that seem to cause one to dream of another kind of existence. And that concept of dreaming is actually very much attached to this relation that she had with the Oriental woman. She dreamed a lot of being in those spaces, inhabiting those kinds of spaces. But given that she was a Russian in Paris, she actually also embodied the concept of the exotic or Oriental woman, because Russia was seen by the French as being highly exotic, as being just, this place where there were all sorts of fairy tales and folk people and peasants still existed, and it made everybody dream a whole lot. Okay, so we have both of those that I'm going to be talking about tonight, and I think the two concepts of femaleness, of the woman, come together in her textile production, and I think they were really very good for marketing as well. Okay, so let's look at Russia, which is where she grew up, and see what Russia was, what the French thought of when they thought of Russia. They thought of bright colors, they thought of folk designs, they thought of little toys, they thought, of course, of the Matryoshka figure that you, I'm sure, are all familiar with over here. Here's a little, here's a little doll that is in traditional Russian folk costume, and of course we have a nice little rooster over here. Now, the reason that I'm showing you these kinds of things is because there were outlets in Paris of Russian folk art, because in Russia, actually, the nobility at that particular time around the turn of the century were starting crafts workshops for the peasants as a way of sort of providing a peasant industry. And then those were marketed worldwide, but particularly, of course, in Western Europe. And from about 1900 on, there were more and more Russian crafts shops that were appearing in Paris, and they were becoming quite the fad. So people really had that image in their mind of all of these folk phenomena. And the colors that went with these designs were particularly important and strong as well. And I've brought you in here some examples of Ukrainian textiles, which, and that's interesting because this was Sonia's very, very young childhood, which she remembered well for the colors that surrounded her. The colors that were present in Ukrainian textile designs of the period were even more, I think, more strident than what one would find from other parts of Russia. So this association of Russia with color and also with pattern, I think, was pretty strong in the French mind. Then to add to that, we have, of course, before the First World War, the phenomenon of the Ballet Russe, which was organized by the impresario Diaghilev, with Russian, most of you probably know something about that, with Russian dancers and, for the most part, Russian music. But in fact, the Ballet Russe opened in Paris in 1909, and it never did perform in Russia. It was very, very definitely an export phenomena based, because there was a taste for it, that was part of the point, in the Western world. And the phenomenon of the Ballet Russe was based very much on folk themes, on the choreography that included a lot of folk dances, and on costumes. And I've brought you in here some spectacular examples by Leon Bakst, who was a friend of Sonia Delaunay's and also her favorite designer from the Ballet Russe. And we can kind of see why, because his designs here are all filled with color and filled with pattern, much less geometric than what hers would be, but we can see the seed of this interest, and we see very strongly the connection of the image of Russia with color and pattern over and over again. Okay, so the Ballet Russe opened in 1909, and it didn't take, with several performances that year, it didn't take long for fashion designers in Paris to pick up on this phenomenon of the exotic Oriental image coming in from Russia, particularly Paul Poiret, who immediately began to incorporate Ballet Russe ideas into his fashion designs. And what we see, let me get the right one, what we see here in 1910, he has loosened the waist, and in fact, he's gotten rid of the corset, and probably the woman was really quite comfortable here, as opposed to what she would be when it really got loose in the 1920s. But he's allowed for that kind of freedom of movement. These are just examples. This 1911 evening dress, we can see, has harem legs on it and is very much covered with beads. It's really an Oriental luxury. And then by 1912, he continued this concept, but actually of the loose waistline, the full flowing form, and simplified tailoring, but in fact introduced what we know of now as the hobble skirt. So women were not liberated completely. They could move, but only within a certain restricted area that the hobble skirt would allow them to. Okay, well, it's right about at this point that Sonia Delaunay is in Paris, has married, has had a baby, and feeling as though under these new circumstances she actually didn't have as much money as she would like to have. She, and I will insist this was rather playfully, decided to take up the practices of Russian peasants in order to design her home, to equip her home, to decorate her home. And she began with this baby quilt that we see here that was probably produced in 1912 and is made of patchwork. She actually purchased a lot of the materials that were used here because she wanted them in very, very specific colors and also in very specific textures. But she created this patchwork baby quilt to go on the bed of her child. So anybody who walked in the house and saw her as a mother would also realize that she was most definitely still an artist, as she picked up the baby to show them. And she began, after that, this initial undertaking to create patchwork for everything, including for her own clothing. And we see her here in her first simultaneous dress, and it is a contemporary fashion onto which she has put patchwork, hand-designed patchwork, but we can see that this is the hobble skirt here. It did have a slit up the back so that she could kick if she wished to do the tango, which was very popular at that time. In actual fact, she didn't tango, but it was the style. And the rest of her body is completely covered with what we should imagine as being colors of this sort. So she's now wrapped in motion, and the motion of color particularly. And where did all that come from? Well, that came certainly was strongly produced in interaction with the work of her husband, who was painting during this period his famous series called The Circular Forms that we see here. This is one of, maybe 20 of these works. There's a big one at the Modern. I think there's some at the Guggenheim. At any rate, what we see that he's doing, and she was at the same time also in painting, is working with contrasts of colors, of very bright colors, saturated colors, pure colors, placed in juxtaposition. And what happens when colors this intense are placed in juxtaposition is that particularly at those places where they come together, your eye actually is so impacted by these colors that your eye starts to vibrate. And that was really what Sonia Delaunay was looking to do, was to get your eye to vibrate as a way of setting you as the viewer in motion. So once again, this has to do with motion. This is one of the most important forms of motion that we have in Delaunay designs, is the motion of the contrast of colors. Okay, let me see where I am here. Well, okay, this is all from before World War I, a period of intense avant-garde activity in Paris. But then in 1914, the war broke out, and that was in the summer of 1914, and Robert and Sonia were in Spain on vacation. And they decided to simply stay on the Iberian Peninsula because they had absolutely no desire to partake in the war in any way. They were in Madrid for a little while and then wound up on the coast of Portugal for well over a year, where Sonia insists that they actually had a great time. Now, this got them in lots of trouble with people who were back fighting the war. At a later point, but she says of this period, a dream life. We could work quietly from morning to night. The villa was perched on the sand dunes facing the sea, with cacti blooming in the garden. I thought I was living a fairy tale. And I want to point out that here she is. This is Sonia Delaunay, standing in front of one of her paintings, such as this one of the marketplace in Minho. But she's dressed in Portuguese folk costume. She wore Portuguese folk costume most of the time that she was living in that little seaside resort. So she was having a very good time actually assuming this, this exotic, folkish style, and incorporated that into the kind of works that she would produce later. But it wasn't a brand new concept. We have in the archives this famous photograph of her as a young girl, but in St. Petersburg, dressed up as a Russian peasant for one of the costume parties that she attended during that period. So we have her returning to a dream and actually the kind of dress-up habits of her youth. She took this experience and actually began to use it practically after 1917. In 1917, they came back to Spain because Portugal joined the war. But in 1917, as many of you, I'm sure, remember or know from your history books, the Russian Revolution took place. And she lost all of her income. So they were left in Spain penniless. And it was necessary that somebody make a living. She looked at her husband and quickly realized that he wasn't going to be able to do it. So it just wasn't quite his character. So she began to make objects for sale. She'd been making these kinds of accessories actually for quite a while just to sort of share with friends, but she began to make them for sale, and through Diaghilev, whom we're going to see again in a moment, he put her in contact with the aristocracy of Madrid. She opened a boutique in Madrid and began to sell fashion designs, all sorts of interior decor, pots and lots of pots and umbrellas and pillows. And here we can see she actually did interior designing for aristocratic homes. And the quality of these designs, or the character of these designs, is big flowers, lots of leaves, lots of big fruit. I mean, it's very much inspired by her experience in Portugal, which reminded her of her experience in her youth in the Ukraine. But you also have to picture these in very, very bright colors. So we've got Ukrainian-style colors that in many instances on the textiles were embroidered with wool. So they had that quality of embroidery that was associated also with Russia, and that would be extremely vibrant to experience. This was also, of course, after the Russian Revolution. There were Russians just pouring out of Russia to all of the cities in Western Europe, including Madrid. And most of those people, particularly even the aristocrats, she didn't have aristocrats working for her here, but most of those women knew how to do embroidery. So there was an incredible labor force that could provide her with the hours, and they could actually do a lot of the labor that made this new boutique business take off, and it did. Okay. In the meantime, we have the Ballet Russe, always in the background for such a long time. In Barcelona in 1917, she ran into Diaghilev, and he had just brought the Ballet Russe down to Spain, where they were practicing, and they were getting ready to restage the ballet Cleopatra for presentation in London. And he commissioned Sonia Delaunay to do the costumes for Cleopatra. And she did all of the costumes. We still have 3 or 4 of them existing, and this is the costume for Cleopatra herself, which in this photograph is being worn by the lead dancer Chernachova. The costume itself is in the Los Angeles County Museum, along with the headdress today, and they have a couple of others from that ballet there too. And here we have, up at the top, we have Sonia Delaunay next to Diaghilev and some other people, Stravinsky, I think, and this is Robert Delaunay there, so the whole group is together. Lost my place here. Okay. Cleopatra, the Egyptian queen, known, all the myths about Cleopatra, very independent woman, also very sexy woman, lots of liberty there, also certainly very exotic, lots of dream tales about her. Cleopatra was also somebody whom Sonia Delaunay dressed up as. when she was about 1914, and this is another of these famous photographs that we have from the archive. So we can see this sort of investment of her own life and her own dreams in many of the projects that she completes. But Cleopatra was a pretty important event for her, and also, I think, important conceptually, because of the way in which the ballet was staged. Cleopatra, in this ballet, actually was brought out onto the stage in a coffin, and the coffin was set on the floor, and she rose, the ballerina who played the part, rose up out of the coffin, completely swathed in scarves, something like 6 different scarves. And here we can see 2 examples of the scarves that were designed by Sonia Delaunay. So here we have the body swathed in scarves, which were then removed one by one, and eventually, and the ballerina herself. But there's something about the concept of coming back from the dead, a rebirth that takes place, the concept of the new woman emerging out of the light of the sun and emerging in a new form, I think is wrapped up metaphorically with this image of Cleopatra that we see here. The scarves were, in fact, really very important, and interestingly worked their way into her later fashion on several levels, as was the concept of Russia. Around 1922, with, once again, I said lots and lots of Russians coming from Russia into Paris, many of them aristocratic women who had, lots of education, lots of culture, who spoke many languages, had no money. They were hired rather quickly by the fashion houses, the Russian aristocratic women, and they served as what were called the serveuses, the women who would take care of clients and sort of be, have a personal relationship with the clients to guide them to the best fashion for them. And so this gave the fashion houses a real air of interesting, sophisticated, cosmopolitan, aristocratic demeanor. And also it's kind of spread a feeling of Russianness throughout the fashion industry. And there was, in fact, a kind of Russian craze that took place around 1922. And although these aren't the best examples, you can see the kind of style that emerged from them that really emphasized pattern and decoration, a lot of embroidery, and looked like the kinds of things I showed you earlier. Interestingly enough, right about that time in 22, there was also a tremendous rage for scarves. Spanish scarves, interestingly enough, became an incredible rage during that time. These would be large scarves that provided a flat surface on which there could be any number of different kinds of patterns. But the point is that this is a move away from tailored jackets or tailored bodices and a move toward open, flat surfaces of fabric as part of the fashion statement of the period. And interestingly here, a whole series of dresses that are made out of scarves. So the scarf was parlayed into all sorts of different fashion forms. And the dresses made out of the scarves, of course, always emphasized particularly the pattern on the scarf or the solid colors on the scarves. So the taste for this kind of bolder design becomes very clear through this period. Okay, Russians pouring into the West, Russians without any money. There were over and over again in the early 20s big charity events that were fundraisers for Russian refugees. And by 1924, Sonia Delaunay, who had been part of several of these, but by 1924, she was actually asked to do the fashions for a major fundraising event at the Hotel Claridge in Paris. She was asked to do, they had fashions of the past, fashions of the present, and fashions of the future. She did fashions of the present and fashions of the future, and what I'm showing you here are her fashions, not of the future, but of the present. And you can see that all of her models are wearing scarves, just simply wrapped around them. And these are scarves, of course, of lengths of materials that she had produced. So they are advertising her design. But note as well these very interesting and strange kinds of headgear. Well, guess where those come from? Those are traditional hats worn by Russian peasants, and also some worn by Russian nobility. The shapes of them are. So this strange kind of geometric form that looks like we have people coming in from outer space is actually very much tied to folk patterns from her homeland. Okay. So we've got scarves that wrap around women and define the coming woman, the woman who's about to be emerging today. And we have scarves upstairs. And these are three that are in the collection upstairs. One that is the kind that she sold a lot. This is embroidered wool, so she would have had Russian needleworkers working on this. This one is actually woven into this design. And this one here is the one that we sort of associate with that period most often, which is a printed silk design. What we can see is that the kinds of designs that come from her at this point are really very, very bold. They're very dramatic and dynamic. They're, I think we could even say, aggressive in the kind of motion, contrast of colors, and also contrast of patterns. So this new woman, through her, the design of her clothing is becoming more and more bold, I guess you would say. Okay. Going from scarves to textile designs is just a quick step. They're not exactly the same thing. A scarf is designed to be a unique design, and textile designs are designed so that they can be repeated, but nonetheless we can see the connection to them. And these are all designs that come from 1924, 1925, the early period. These, and this I've chosen all of these very sort of bold geometric ones in order to make this kind of statement. And I think that we can see here that there's this incredible love of just the intensity of juxtaposing these forms and setting up these kinds of rhythms that I'll talk about again in a moment. Now, I've kind of stacked the deck for you here because I've given you a whole bunch of works shown together, not just one individually, but I've done that purposely because, in fact, that is the way that Sonia Delaunay liked to present her textile patterns, was in juxtaposition with one another and covering whole surfaces. So we see here Sonia Delaunay herself wrapped in several lengths of her own fabric, and here two of her models who are standing against a pastiche of several of her patterns and sitting on them as well, so that the environment really begins to look, at least it reminds me, a lot of what I would imagine it might be like if one were in a tent in the middle of the desert someplace in an exotic culture with fabrics hanging in every direction. It calls up that kind of feeling here. One of the things that we notice is that in the intensity of all of this action of color and design, the human features, the heads, the arms, the legs, tend to take second place. We don't notice them nearly as much as we do the force of the design. This is sort of typical of what was also happening in avant-garde painting or of the period, where the human figure begins to sort of dissolve into these kinds of cosmic movements that the art itself is attempting to display. So it's very much a part of modernism to have that effect there. But the design is foregrounded and the body takes a kind of second place behind it. Okay, so I want to explore just a little bit with you how it is that we look at pattern, because I think it's really essential here. What is going on here that is so delightful to some people, perhaps not at all delightful to others. And in order to do that, I need to, for a moment, take you back to some traditional 19th century academic painting, because there is a different way of looking at this. When we're looking at most figurative painting, most Western tradition painting, there are some things in the painting on the surface that are more important than others. And certainly in these instances by Buckberrough of The Birth of Venus, it is the figure of the female nude that's in the center, and that we all want to look at. You're sort of, all of the things that are around her are in faded colors or dark tones so that we don't really see them that well. We know that we're supposed to look at her because she's in the center, but also because she's so well defined. Over here, it's the figures. This is Gérôme's one of his Oriental scenes of Carpet Merchant. It's the figures that we tend to look at because they're so much better defined. We also look at a decorative motif of the rug, but the figures, their gestures, what they might be saying to one another attracts our eye. Okay, when we look at this kind of work, our eye stops moving. We look in and our eye rests on certain objects that we want to investigate more thoroughly. So you move into the space of the painting and your eye begins to rest there. Not consistently, but I'm generalizing, but that is certainly one of the first things that happens. Look at this. Your eye can't rest anywhere, can it? I mean, there's no way. There firstly is no one thing that is better defined than anything else. There is no possibility of a space beyond the surface here. If you look at any of the colors or any of the forms, you're immediately taken to the next one, to the next one, to the next one. So my point is that when you're looking at pattern, you look at it differently. You look across the surface of it. Your eye moves across the surface of it because it inclines you to do that. You move with the rhythm of the work across it. So that's another kind of motion. That's another kind of motion that the new woman who wore Sonia Delaunay designs had as part of her sense of being a new woman in contemporary culture. She moved because the pattern itself moved, and your eyes move across the surface of her. Okay, so I think that Sonia Delaunay actually was playing a lot with this idea of motion across the surface of a design. And I'm thinking particularly of images like this that we have that she took of models with her textiles in the studio in, it's probably about 1924, 1925, where we have a nude model underneath a swath of silk in one of her printed textile designs. Now here, the silk is working as a cover, most definitely, for the body. And it also is working as a cover that forces your eye to move. If you start over here with this one, you're pushed along right over the surface of the body, pushed along to the back. You're deflected from the body that's underneath there. And in this particular case, this is a thin fabric, so the texture that you can almost see through is playing against the pattern, which seems to be impenetrable. Okay, and I will pose to you that I think that was also part of what happens here. The covering in these bright patterns worked on several levels. It worked as a veil, rather seductively, but it also worked as a cover that was sort of like an armor. It is impenetrable. It protected the new woman's body underneath from the gaze of exterior people who might approach with ideas that she didn't want them to have. Or maybe did, but wasn't going to let them get any further. Okay. Okay. Good. This is a significant image in a photograph in Sonia and Robert Delaunay's cache of photographs from the period. This was from 1924, when she was still definitely at the beginning of producing all of these textile designs. And we see there are three models here, one here, a little covered, and Sonia Delaunay herself wrapped in one of her textile designs. And I've got a few things to say about this image. One, what we see here very well, and what you've seen in several images that I've given you, is this layering of pattern upon pattern upon pattern. So what's happening here is that you're looking at one pattern and your eye moves across that pattern, and then all of a sudden you hit another pattern. And the speed of your vision has to change. The rhythms of the pattern change, so the speed of your vision changes. So it's as though you are moving and then all of a sudden shifting gears, and then moving again and then shifting gears again as you move across these varied patterns that puts your motion into something that can't possibly be boring. It's constantly changing and perhaps upsetting your movement. So you're actually having to concentrate, to think about the movement of your eyes or of yourself if you're trying to inject yourself into that situation as you move through this intensely patterned space, another kind of movement that takes place. The connection between motion and modernity is also strongly embedded in the work of art that's in the background, and which we have pictured here, which is a large-scale canvas that Robert Delaunay did in 1914 called The Homage to Blériot. Blériot was, in fact, an aviator, and he was the first aviator to cross the English Channel in 1909. This was the painting was done in 1914, but he crossed the channel in 1909. And one would assume that he crossed in that plane, but actually he didn't. But this was a plane that Delaunay had available to work with. So what we're seeing here are the lights, the expansive lights of the airplane propellers and airplane lights coming at one at night. And you can see the propeller right there. We've got the airplane in the background. We've got the Eiffel Tower and the Ferris wheel, all of these vehicles of motion. Think of the elevators on the Eiffel Tower. These are all symbols of mechanical things that allow people to move, and to move into new places, and to move rapidly, space up into the air, as a matter of fact. And we have all of these women in front of these kinds of vehicles, in front of all of this motion. And this was certainly not something that just Sonia Delaunay was doing. This was happening across the fashion world, that women actually became a kind of insignia, a sign for the technological age. The presence of the woman, the new woman, was a sign that we are in modernity. The woman, of course, is armored by her patterns. So her body, in some instances, I'm jumping from this to, but if you think of the film Metropolis, which was a few years later, the concept of the woman as a robot or as an alien figure enters into this kind of, what shall we say, she's being defeminized. The body, the traditional female body, is being really changed into something that becomes almost robotic. Okay, one more point I want to make about this image that's really important is that we see here how much, if we hadn't seen before, how much Sonia Delaunay is in a partnership. She's working with her husband, Robert. In this particular instance, he's doing the painting. She also painted, but not at this particular period, and she's doing the design. But it is a unit, an artistic unit that with the same aesthetic moving in different directions. This concept of a marriage in art was something that actually was very strong in Russia, and particularly in Russia, in the Soviet Union right at this time, but also very strong in Germany, not so strong in France, but it was a concept which she knew of and to which she was very dedicated. So one of the things we have to think about is that she was a wife, and that was very important to her life, but also to the marketing of her work. It was within this artistic partnership, and that in certain ways that might affect or limit how far she could take the image of the new woman. And so I juxtapose here, take us back to Coco Chanel. Coco Chanel, who was really known for being utterly independent, and whether we can see that or not, we can certainly imagine it here. But in fact, for Sonia Delaunay, the idea of being in relationship with her husband was absolutely essential. And we have to think in those terms when we are thinking about the way in which she fashioned herself, but then also produced fashions for sale and for other women. Okay. The woman who is the sign of technology, and particularly of motion, of vehicles of motion, also can be directly behind the wheel. And here we see Sonia Delaunay's these sort of famous images of her coats, which were fully with the one upstairs that I'm sure you've all seen. They are wool embroidered, completely covered with wool embroidery. So we understand that this took a lot of work, and she had quite a few embroiderers working for her in order to produce these. But these were extremely popular. And we have them here on all four of these models, and also a fifth one that is wearing a cloche hat. This is actually, those are upstairs as well. We have a car hat, which kept the hair very, very close to the head, as opposed to the cloche, which we have here, as she takes the wheel, and the woman could do this now. I mean, she could get behind the wheel, go wherever she wanted, and she could get a lot further than she could on a horse. So this was part of the liberation of women, that they work well. That liberation depended a lot on technology. Okay, so my point is that in the development of Sonia Delaunay's image up to and beyond 1925 for a Parisian audience, she is the new woman, but she is also strongly connected to the image of the Eastern exotic Oriental woman. She used her hyphenated name, her name from her Russian family was Turk. She used Sonia Delaunay Turk as her marketing name up until about 1922-23. After that, it began to fade off. But that worked very well for her reputation in Paris, because there was such a taste for the new woman, but also a taste for the exotic Eastern woman that lingered on. And she managed to strike a balance in her designs between these two that was quite effective. But in 1925, there was a major exhibition in Paris. It's like a World's Fair. It was called the Exposition Internationale des Arts Modernes, Décoratifs et Industriels, modern, decorative, and industrial arts, inviting countries from all over the world to show their modern, decorative, and industrial arts. And this had been planned for a long time, but finally it happened in 1925, and it really was a time when Paris wanted to put themselves back on the map, the international map, as being the center of particularly decorative, modern decorative design. They invited Americans. The American government wrote back and said, "We don't think we have any." Isn't that interesting? The concept, they had lots of decorative design. The concept of modern design, modern decorative design, was sort of unknown in America at that time. So America sent huge numbers of people to this fair, particularly, as did much of the Western Hemisphere. In this fair, Sonia Delaunay had a boutique that she shared with a furrier that was on a bridge that crosses the Seine. It was the Pont Alexandre III, the Alexander III, the third bridge, which was the fanciest bridge in Paris. It was dedicated in 1900 by the last Tsar of Russia, Alexander III, and it was on that bridge that the organizers of the fair installed lined both sides of the bridge with boutique fronts. Now this is interesting. They weren't actual shops. They were vitrines that showed goods, but you couldn't go in them. So this was also sort of showing the importance of modern shop windows, because those were a relatively new phenomenon. And so she arranged this shop window with all of her contrasting designs that you see in here. And it was noted by lots of people in the press, and certainly it was noted by lots of Americans who came to the fair. And so she suddenly had a much expanded audience that moved more intensely than ever before toward America, where not only did her fashion designs begin to sell, but the textile designs really took off and were often manufactured not as artisanal designs, but under industrial processes. So she got a lot of good business from America at that time. This is her business card from the exhibition, from what she called the boutique simultanée. Simultaneity was the term for all of this kind of color art stuff that she did. And when we look at this, we can see that she is Sonia Delaunay, that there is nothing here that sort of associates her with Russia anymore. This is the card that's beginning to send her out into the world beyond Paris. She's thinking of opening up a store in London and also one in Rio de Janeiro. Neither of these really got very far along, but they were part of the plan. But when she's thinking about moving into internationally on this level, it's much, much more important for her to be French, for the Association of Paris to be foregrounded, rather than Russia, which nobody in America would know much of anything about. It wouldn't have the same exotic flavor. And so her identity then becomes really fused in her imagery with Paris. It had been to a certain point up there, but it really does now, so that we have her on this calling card putting the image of the new woman directly on top of the Eiffel Tower with the name Delaunay underneath. Or here, these are models, once again, in coats, who are posing at this was during the 1925 exposition, in front of a very, very large painting done by Robert Delaunay for the exposition, which is a painting of the Eiffel Tower. So the connection there with Paris becomes even solidified, totally solidified by that, after that point. Okay, so here we have Sonia Delaunay, and in several views that you see here. And I will just summarize by saying that she is the new woman. She's wearing the design of the new woman. I'll propose to you that she's letting the designs do the work of dynamic motion that's necessary for the new woman. But when we look more carefully and look at her face particularly, and it is so interesting how often she turns to the left. It's not absolute, but it's so interesting how often that's there. We'll see that she's not looking out at us. She's not smiling. She's not smiling a great big huge smile. She's not open and extroverted that way. She is serene. She is, if anything, perhaps even demure. And she is maintaining, I would propose, the mystery of the exotic woman that she brought with her from Russia and that she perpetuated on French soil. Even in her late years, she was unceasingly delighted by the motion of colors and patterns. And it was at this point in her life when she, we heard about this at the gathering here a month or so ago, that when she went out on the town, went out to see the world, she was in the habit of renting a Rolls Royce and went around to the park and other places in her Rolls Royce and in her colors and patterns, or sometimes wearing Chanel outfits, as a matter of fact. And I think that until the end of her life, she remained absolutely modern, but she never really relinquished the dream of the exotic East that she associated with her homeland. Thank you. I'd be happy to answer some questions if anybody has any. Yes?
When did she?
Wait, let's see. She's going to bring you yeah.
Did
Because otherwise it doesn't go out.
Did she continue to design later in the later years, like let's say after the 30s or in the late 30s or
yes,
the 40s?
that's let's see. I've got this on right. That's an important point. because she said in her memoirs, and she sort of spread the word, that she closed down the shop in 1931, and she was so happy to be rid of it because it was so much work. She really wanted to go back to just doing painting and being an artist and so on and so forth. But in fact, we know very well, and particularly so from the collection from Metz and Company upstairs, that she continued producing textile designs well into the 50s and even up into the 60s. Yes?
Two things. I happened to be brought up by school run by Russians,
Oh, really?
and their thing was that besides reading, writing, arithmetic, is that we should all learn embroidery at an early age.
Oh, how perfect.
Yes. The other thing that came to my mind looking at these, her designs, strikes me like we're looking at American Indian lines also.
Oh, yes, right. It's very hard to separate all of that out. She probably didn't know that much about American Indian designs, but there was a lot of African designs that certainly were well known in Paris at that time, and there was a fad for African patterns as well. So it's a synthesis. Certainly what she's doing is designing color and form for and trying to get the highest contrast and the most motion out of it. But you can read in a lot of, shall we say, exotic. In those days, they would have talked about those as primitive cultures, but there's certainly exotic cultures that were played up in an awful lot of the design that we call Art Deco design, in furniture design, as well as and wallpaper design and so on, as well as in fashion design. So I don't think there probably is anything direct there, but I understand perfectly. Yeah.
One last thing is I happen to teach nature outdoors.
Yeah.
And we teach them about protective adaptation of animals,
Yeah.
protective coloration. And it breaks
Oh.
up the lights so they can't be hunted easily. You can't figure out which is the head. So
Right.
a lot of this is sort of protective coloration for people.
Oh, absolutely. I think so. I think that's a wonderful idea. Yeah, that it extends my concept of armor to another level. It's really, really great. But it was also true that well, during this is a funny story. While they were in Portugal, she was busy painting on the beach, and she was painting these big concentric circles that were part of the style of the painting she was doing. And these were seen one day by the Portuguese authorities, and they were quite sure that she was trying to signal to Germans out at sea. So that what she was doing was some sort of code, right? And in actual fact, it caused her a huge amount of trouble because she wasn't able to she went to Spain and she wasn't able to get back into Portugal at one point for a week until they straightened it out. But there was also a period during the Second World War when, no, that wasn't, it must have been the First World War, when there was talk about them doing camouflage designs. Never actually happened, but you can see how it could have very easily. Yeah. Yes. Let's see. We need to pass the microphone.
What happened if she was Jewish? What happened to her during World War II,
Yeah.
being in France?
Right. When the Germans came close to Paris, they had to get out in a hurry because on her birth certificate, it still had her original name, which was Stern. And so, I mean, if that had been looked at, she would have been taken away very quickly. So they packed up everything, she and Robert, and he was quite ill at the time. They packed up as much as they could, put it in the car, and they headed south. And they stayed. Robert actually passed away not long thereafter. She spent most of the war in Grasse, which is close to, it's in the mountains above not far from the coast, in the south of France under the Vichy government. When she came back to Paris, everything was still there. So she was relieved that nothing had been, everything was still intact. But it was a scary time. She lost a huge amount of weight. Yes?
We heard a lot the whole way through about this sort of very interesting class relationships going on in her life, and I was wondering if you might address a little more directly the contradictions in terms of her relationships with very different classes and very different sort of cultural ideas of class.
Right.
And how she maybe was aware of or addressed those contradictions.
Yes, it's a very good question, and I'm not sure that I've ever been able to fathom them completely. But she did, the family where she was raised in St. Petersburg was an assimilated Jewish, but upper bourgeoisie, very close to the Tsar, incredibly wealthy. And she entered the world with that kind of assurance, I guess we could say that, which is, I think, probably why her thinking about her Ukrainian roots was kind of dream, because it was so distant from the life that she'd grown up with after that. She, like a lot of urban Russians of the period, she was incredibly enamored of the peasants, or there's some notes in her diaries at one point where there was a real Cossack that came to town and they actually saw him, you know. And so, I mean, she was, even though she was Russian, she was separated from those kinds of people to the extent that they became, people from the East or the peasants became exotic for her. Robert Delaunay, who was of bourgeois upbringing, nonetheless became a staunch socialist, at least in his outbursts of theory. So there are complicated times. For example, her statement about their reactions when they lost all their money in the Russian Revolution. They said, we were left penniless on the street, but we were crying for joy for the people of Russia. You know, and I think that, I mean, it was really complicated and not necessarily so clearly thought out. I would venture to say that maybe that was a little bit why there's a kind of role-playing that happens a lot. I'm psychologizing there, but I have been through the whole talk. So, but I think that has perhaps to do with the incredible disjunctions in her life, and those relationships were not very clear. But she was, she had all of these people working for her, and she talked about them as her, what was the word that she used? I think that she used the word nègre, her blacks. So that tells you something, I guess. She was an aristocrat in consciousness, I think.
You said that she had a child. Whatever became of that child?
Oh,
Whatever became of that child. And then second, did she live on her final days in Paris? Is that where she died? Mm-hmm.
Yes. She lived in Paris all the rest of her life, with trips, of course, places. But yes, Charles Delaunay grew up to be the most famous of the period historians of jazz, and wrote I think it was a 10-volume encyclopedia of jazz, which was the classic reference for jazz. And you can sort of see, I didn't go into the whole thing about dance and music that could be connected with all of this so well, but the switching of rhythms, it's not unrelated to what one might associate with jazz. And she loved jazz, and Robert did too, and they would rush to the latest Satchmo concert, and Le Jazz Hot was coming up in the 30s particularly, and Charles was old enough at that point to actually, he hosted jazz sessions. So he had a very interesting life. And
Is he still alive?
No, he's no longer alive. I'm not going to be, I think that he passed away in the 90s. I can't remember exactly. Let's get a okay, I'll repeat your question. Yes, what is it that you like? The question was if I know anything about the Atelier on Rue Saint-Simon. Yes, the last place that she lived, and probably this was taken in, this is probably in the apartment next door, but she, her last place of residence was on the Rue Saint-Simon in the 7th in Paris. A double floor studio with balconies. This was really quite wonderful. And she moved there in the 60s, I think, and stayed there for the rest of her life, and then bought the apartment next door that she was able to use then as a storage area, which is probably where this is taken. Yeah, so it was very modern and very beautiful. You've seen it, or?
Oh, yes.
Uh-huh. You know, you visited her? No. No.
I just know the place.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Yes. Any further questions? We have to get you the microphone in order for it to go on online.
Did any other designers use her fabric patterns in their clothes, like a Chanel or somebody, or Perot or some use them?
That's a good question. Certainly Chanel didn't, and I don't think she would actually. The fabrics were produced by 2 or 3 textile companies, and they probably were picked up and used by some designers, but not major names. I mean, that would have been too much conflict. If a major name picked up Sonia Delaunay, it would, destroy the image of that other house. So, but you see the designs showing up, in various places, and that's before ready-made. So they were picked up by some designers, but not your major ones. Okay, one last one, maybe. Or let's see, what time is it? That's fine.
Were all her designs on paper, or did she ever do any embroidery or any technical things as well?
Yes, she did embroidery herself from early on, but not very consistently. We have some embroidery from 1909. We have some. I think there were. She used to say that it was very difficult to. She could not paint next to her husband. It drove him crazy. So when, it's sort of loose translation, but it's approximately. But I think that there were definitely times when they were spending time together and they hadn't figured out the space yet, and she wanted to do something, she would pick up embroidery and do it. And we do have some of those in Paris. There are some of her own designs. And it's true, actually, there are some of the later textile designs that we see picked up in embroidery for ribbons and for some other, decorative uses. But now that I'm thinking about that, I'm not sure how much of that was actually done by her. It's a good question, but there are examples, definitely. Okay, thank you all very much for coming.